Starting.
So should we get started, Martha? Are you happy
I'm
with
good
that?
with that. I'm good with that.
All right, let's go. We've got a lot to cover. So yeah, welcome everyone. Welcome back to those who've already attended the masterclass and the Q&As, and welcome to new participants. I know some people here are new today. It's really lovely to get registrants from all over the world. I think, as someone just said, that it's 1 o'clock in the morning for them there. So thank you for everyone for making the effort to attend. There's been a lot of interest in these presentations. We've had many people signing up, and obviously having them recorded means that they are accessible for people in different time zones. So I think last time I did introduce myself, I'll just briefly introduce myself for new participants here. So I'm a therapist and supervisor in private practice in Brighton, which is in the UK. And I'm also a tutor at the Karuna Institute in Bristol, which offers trainings in relational mindfulness, including core process psychotherapy, which is the modality in which I trained. Martha and I had the idea to set up this series of masterclasses and Q&As. Actually, it was originally going to be one event, but it's kind of grown. We're doing the opposite of the corporate thing, as we're just kind of making up as we go along. And I really enjoyed her work because I attended her boot camp, her psychodynamic psychotherapy boot camp at the William James College a few years back. And it was entitled Understanding Life Backwards, but Living It Forwards. I got a lot out of it. It was a lot of fun, and I really wanted to do something with her this side of the pond, and these events were born. I would like to take this opportunity to let you know, and I only found this out just before this Zoom call, that Martha will again be running the boot camp this October through William James College. Registration will open on the 1st of March, so you need to keep an eye out on her website, and I think we'll post the website in the chat because it's very oversubscribed and registrations are capped apparently, so you'll have to sign up early if you want to get on, but it's a lot of fun. It's intensive, it's very accessible, it's all on Zoom, and yeah, I highly recommend it. I wanted to thank Robert Downs and the Relational School for supporting this event. Without them, this wouldn't be happening. So real great appreciation to them. Quickly going to zoom through some practicals, zoom through them. So we're all muted during the presentation. We invite you to post your questions, your comments, your reflections in the chat, and we're going to actually save the chat. There's so much material, we won't have time to answer questions today, but we have decided to put on, and we've really just decided this in the last half an hour, to put on an additional Q&A, and the date that we've come up with is Sunday the 19th of February, and it's going to be at the slightly later time of 1800 UK, which is 6 p.m. in the UK, which is 1300 or 1 p.m. Eastern time. It will be the same Zoom link, and I will send out another reminder and the Zoom link again. And of course, everyone is warmly invited to that Q&A. I myself found the last Q&A very helpful and informative, and I think you'll enjoy it if you can make it. There are also a number of additional events, Zoom events, that Martha will be doing. These are all listed on her website, so please do check out the website and see what ones you might want to attend. CPD, continuing professional development certificates, mainly I think in the UK and Europe we use these, but we have, or Robert I should say, has created them, and he's going to post them in the chat. If you want to just download it and fill it in, please do, and we'll do an additional CPD certificate for those that attend the second Q&A. As Martha just said, everything's being recorded and everything's available to watch. Someone wrote to me and said, what's the time limit? And there's no time limit. They're on YouTube. You can watch them forever. Again, there's a link. I think Robert's called it Martha's playlist for now, which will cover everything. So you just need to click on that. You can see all the recordings and also the PDFs. I think you can get there. And just finally, if anything happens and you get bounced out of this Zoom meeting, if you just click on the original link, you'll be let back in. So very quickly, I just want to once again reintroduce Martha Stark, MD, who is a graduate of Harvard Medical School and the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute. She's a holistic psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. She is on the faculty at Harvard Medical School and is an award-winning author of 9 highly acclaimed books on the integration of psychodynamic theory into clinical practice, several of which have become required reading in psychoanalytic training institutes and psychodynamic psychotherapy programs, not only in the States, but also all around the world. Following on from Masterclass 1 and the Q&A, I wanted to share a few comments that I feel accurately reflect my own experience. And I'm keeping all this brief because there's so much to cover. Just 3 comments. First one is, her ability to be so concise and precise regarding such complex topics astounds me. Martha's slides are tremendously thought-provoking and at times very moving, as she is so transparent with her experience. There is so much information. I'm grateful for the recordings and the PDFs. And I'd like to say I'm very grateful too. So without further ado, please fasten your seatbelts as we get ready for Masterclass Part 2. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me see, wait. Okay, good. Can you see it? I think. And Robert, if you could please humor me a little bit, muting everybody, and then I will unmute myself because there's still some numbers of people who aren't muted. So if you could do that, I would appreciate it. And now I unmuted myself. So I hope you can see me and hear me. All right. Thank you, Adele, so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you also, Robert, for, both of you and the Relational School for making this possible, for hosting these master classes, and for inspiring me. It was really inspiring me to sort of do again my William James College presentation, month-long Zoom course in October of 2023 on Model 5. And I'll probably mumble a little bit more about that over the course of our time here. But just I really appreciate and you both, and my heart goes out to you both. All right. So this is about accessing your right brain's intuitive giftedness and your left brain's analytic finesse. Now I'm going to do sort of an overview reminder of my psychodynamic synergy paradigm, real quick like. Then I'm going to launch into Model 1, optimally stressful conflict statements. Model 2, optimally stressful disillusionment statements. We'll take a very brief break and then return for Model 3, the intersubjective perspective of contemporary psychoanalytic theory, contemporary relational theory. And I'll be talking about accountability statements or relational interventions, or actually my rule of 3. All right. So let's see if I can get this going. Okay, well, today is today, yes. So first, by way of a brief review, my psychodynamic synergy paradigm. I've already, since last 2 weeks ago, I have updated and evolved things a little bit. So I now call it either my or the, I'm not sure, psychodynamic synergy paradigm, a CARE approach to deep healing. This is not about superficial healing. There are other things for superficial healing, which are fabulous, and I do them. But we're talking about deep healing. And as some of you now would know, C, cognitive, A, affective, R, relational, and E, existential, which captures the essence of my first 4 models in this psychodynamic synergy paradigm. Also, Model 5 is around, but it doesn't have an initial yet. It's not been added to this. And then Model 6, my holistic approach, that's more unthought known than known at the moment. So anyway, so for now, my psychodynamic synergy paradigm features 5 modes of therapeutic action. In other words, 5 different approaches to catalyzing transformation of psychological rigidity into psychological flexibility, a la ACT, and quite frankly, a la Freud and some of the ego psychology folks. All right, so my psychodynamic synergy paradigm, a synergistic approach to deep healing. So just real quick, like enhancement of knowledge within, which is the interpretive perspective of classical psychoanalysis. Model 2, provision of experience for, notice the prepositions, the corrective provision or deficiency compensation perspective of self-psychology. Model 3, engagement in relationship with, the intersubjective perspective of contemporary relational theory. So we have within, for, and with. We have knowledge, experience, and relationship. And my Modes of Therapeutic Action book was entitled Modes of Therapeutic Action, knowledge, actually, I guess it was enhancement of knowledge, provision of experience, and engagement in relationship. And I'm working on an updated, revised version of that book for Rowman and Littlefield, even as we speak. Model 4, facilitation of surrender to. This is an existential, humanistic approach, which is more Adele's approach, although Adele also has many other approaches as well. An existential humanistic approach to mending brokenness, securing the attachment, and easing existential angst. Model 5, envisioning of possibilities beyond. A quantum neuroscientific approach that features therapeutic memory reconsolidation, thank you, Hannah, to overcoming analysis paralysis and stuckness. All right, so just real quick, like Model 1, cognitive, structural conflict, which is classical psychoanalytic, structural deficit, self-psychological. Notice the symmetry, please. Relational conflict, a la Stephen Mitchell, contemporary relational. Relational deficit, thanks to Larry Hedges, who made me come up with my Model 4, thereby enhancing tremendously my psychodynamic synergy paradigm, an existential humanistic approach. And then Model 5, constructivist or more directive. And this is more about neural enhancement, and it's a quantum neuroscientific approach. So all 5 PSP models capitalize upon the therapeutic provision of optimal stress. Again, we're talking about deep healing to advance the patient from long-standing, deeply entrenched, maladaptive rigidity to newfound, more evolved, more adaptive flexibility, with an eye to incentivizing deep and sustained characterological or psychodynamic or structural change. All right, but our focus today will be on the first 3 models, the 3 major psychoanalytic schools: knowledge, experience, and relationship. The first of which is classical, the second and third of which are more contemporary. So Model 1, now we have Sigmund Freud, Anna Freud, Heinz Hartmann, David Rappaport, to name a few of the stars. Model 2, we have the corrective provision perspective of self-psychology and those object relations theories emphasizing internal absence of good or structural deficit, resulting from relational deprivation and neglect. Heinz Kohut, Michael Balint, Paul and Anna Ornstein. And then we have Model 3, the intersubjective perspective of contemporary relational theory, and those object relations theories emphasizing not internal absence of good, but internal presence of bad. And of course, a person, an individual, a patient, can have structural conflict, Model 1, structural deficit, Model 2, relational conflict, Model 3, relational deficit, Model 4, or be stuck, refractory inertia, Model 5. All right, so now Model 3, the intersubjective perspective resulting from relational trauma and abuse. Now we have Stephen Mitchell, Jay Greenberg, Jessica Benjamin, Jean Baker Miller. All right, so this was one of my favorite slides from last time. So Model 1, cognitive, Model 2, affective, Model 3, relational. Now that's CAR, C-A-R, whatever that might mean. Similarly and reassuringly, Alan Shore has highlighted what he describes as a paradigm shift over the course of the years, over the course of the decades, from his words, left brain conscious cognition, which is my Model 1, to right brain unconscious emotional processes, which is my Model 2, and right brain unconscious relational dynamics, which is my Model 3. So Model 1, cognitive privileges, that fancy word, cognitive head thoughts, targets the patient's internal conflictedness and reluctance to acknowledge anxiety-provoking truths about the self, and thus the need for defense. Model 2, affective, heart, feelings are privileged. These are, as you know, as I've said before, these are mutually enhancing, not mutually exclusive. This model targets the patient's relentless pursuits and reluctance, notice the symmetry, please, to confront and grieve anxiety-provoking truths about the objects of her desire, and thus the defense. And model 3, relational hand behaviors, target the patient's compulsive reenactments and reluctance to take ownership of anxiety-provoking truths about the self in relation, in the terms of the Stone Center at Wellesley College in Massachusetts there, or about the relational self. All right, so head, model 1, heart, model 2, feelings, hands, model 3. Just two or three more here. Model 1, cognitive. The therapeutic action then focuses on, and we're going to be using these optimally stressful conflict statements to show you how we do this, focuses on interpreting the anxiety-provoking truths about the patient's self. Model 2, self-psychology and other deficit theories. The therapeutic action focuses on grieving anxiety-provoking truths about the objects of the patient's desire, namely their limitations, separateness, and immutability, and features disillusionment statements to facilitate grieving, which will result then in adaptive transmuting internalizations of the good that had been prior to the disillusionment. Okay, and filling in their biostructural deficit. All right, model 3, the relational approach. The therapeutic action focuses on owning anxiety-provoking truths about the patient's relational self and features accountability statements or relational interventions. Model 1 then, so we're going to, and as I supervise and sometimes as I sit with my patients, but not always, I'm thinking either interpreting model 1 or grieving model 2 or negotiating model 3 or model 4, facilitating their surrender to absolute dependence on me and so on, and model 5 when I'm envisioning possibilities for what could be. So anyway, model 1, interpreting. The therapeutic action involves resolving internal conflict or structural conflict or neurotic conflict or intrapsychic conflict by interpreting the resistance. That's classical. To advance the patient from resistance to insight or awareness. Had to say awareness because that starts with A. The defenses start with R, as you remember, and the adaptations start with A, and the optimal stressors, as we will see, start with D, so that the system is RAD, R-A-D. Model 2, the focus is more on grieving, and the therapeutic action, therefore, involves adaptively, not defensively, which would be less healthy, but adaptively, which is more healthy, adaptively internalizing external good by grieving disillusionment or disappointment. So where before there had been illusion, all was well, positive transference, it's all good, idealizing transference, yes, yes. Then when the inevitable disappointments happen, disillusionments, the focus of the work will be on facilitating the patient's grieving to advance them from relentless hope to acceptance, sober, mature acceptance. And it's done by way, as a result of the grieving, that goes hand in hand with adaptive internalization of external good. And model 3 is about negotiating. The therapeutic action now involves detoxifying internal badness, the charged toxic boluses, the pathogenic introjects, the internal introjected bad mother, by or bad father or bad caregiver, by negotiating at Darlene Ehrenberg's intimate edge of relatedness in order to advance the patient from reenactment to accountability. Overview. The therapeutic action in all 3 models involves working through the optimal stress created by the therapist's interventions that alternately challenge and then support. Remember, I actually said that these optimally stressful interventions will be, in essence, superimposing an acute injury on top of a chronic one. And again, some of you may be like, oh my God, that's a terrible thought. And the rest of you, when I'm reminding you, this is about trying to catalyze deep psychodynamic structural change, yeah, we got to do a little something, because in the words of Charles Krebs, self-organizing systems, which indeed the patient's defensive self-protective mechanisms are, self-organizing, open, complex, adaptive systems resist perturbation, resist being disrupted. And so we got to do some fair bit of something in order to sort of destabilize the dysfunctional status quo. All right, so whether the optimal stressor is, here are the D words, cognitive dissonance, model 1, affective disillusionment, model 2, or relational detoxification, model 3. Okay, this you're not expected to understand. Even I hardly understand it, and I wrote it. So I'll just say it real quickly. Working through the stress, optimal stress of gain, secondary gain, become pain. In other words, ego-syntonic become ego-dystonic, for those of you who sort of from way back learned it in those terms, thereby transforming resistance into awareness. Model 2, working through the stress of good, illusion, become bad. Illusion become disillusionment, or positive transference disrupted, thereby transforming relentless hope into sober, mature acceptance. And model 3, working through the stress of bad become good. Distortion become more realistic perception of the reality. In other words, working through in the negative transference, which is different from positive transference disrupted. So we will see that in model 2, we're talking about, by way of grieving, serial accretion of new good to fill in deficit. Model 3, we're talking about serial dilution of old bad. And projective identification and negotiating at the intimate edge of relatedness. And I'm here reminded of Philip Romberg's safe but not too safe, as sort of describing the optimal therapeutic relationship. Okay, so model 1, here we go. The interpretive perspective of classical psychoanalysis. And now this first sentence, wait, let me move something here. Okay, all right. This first sentence is a little tricky. But let me just sort of say it and bear with me on this. This is sort of the introduction. It's about structural conflict or neurotic conflict or intrapsychic conflict that Freud wrote about. It's about conflict between anxiety provoking, because remember, I place a lot of value on, keeping your finger ever on the pulse of the level of the patient's anxiety and capacity to tolerate further challenge. And it's about leveraging the patient's anxiety. So structural conflict between anxiety provoking, think id, but ultimately growth promoting, once its energy can be harnessed, whatever, between anxiety provoking, but ultimately growth promoting and awareness promoting and insight promoting forces pressing yes, and anxiety relieving, defensive, but growth impeding, counter forces defending no. So I think this, and then I think this, or sort of more traditionally, the ego mobilizing a defense to put a lid on the id. That's where I learned it a billion years ago. All right, so you may not get that yet, but it will become clear in a moment. Most of our patients are conflicted about most things most of the time, with one part of them invested in maintaining same old, same old. I now call it sometimes, I can say rigid defense, outdated defense, or I can say same old, and then we want to evolve the patient to something new, different, and better, or a more flexible adaptation. And I sort of use these terms interchangeably, same old for rigid defense, something new, different, and better for more flexible adaptation. Okay, so with one part of them invested in maintaining same old, and another part of them beginning to appreciate, as a result of the work we're doing with them, albeit with ever increasing anxiety, both the price paid for that misplaced loyalty to same old, and the enlivening possibility of something new, different, and better. So we're going to be generating internal dissonance, cognitive dissonance, cognitive little affective dissonance between their investment in old bad, same old, and their beginning to appreciate that sort of like, whoops, Houston, we have a problem. Not so good. So Model 1 conflict statements are universally applicable interventions that target these states of internal dividedness or conflictedness, and they work across the board. And my model, yes, about deep healing, but whether it's crisis intervention, trauma work, short-term intensive, or longer-term, broader-based, yes. And I used to think sort of like, well, I didn't really do, I'm a psychoanalyst, I don't really do short-term intensive work. And then as somebody pointed out to me one day, but Martha, for years you've been doing, 1, 2, 3, 5 session, 10 session consultations. And do you think you get some real deep work done there? And sort of like, well, yeah, I do. And I realized that it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have the patient for a long time. But rather, again, I think optimal stress is at the heart of what catalyzes deep change. All right, so conflict statements. So on the one hand, again, these conflict statements, and I want by the end of today, I really hope that you'll be able to sort of have some facility with these conflict statements, which are really universally applicable. So on the one hand, highlighting the patient's ever-evolving awareness of her investment in same old, same old. So that's how there's gain for her, secondary gain, but gain for her. On the other hand, highlighting, we're going to juxtapose these, highlighting the patient's ever-evolving awareness of the price paid. I'm sorry, let me do something to my screen here. Okay. On the other hand, highlighting the patient's ever-evolving, as a result of the work we're doing, awareness of the price paid for that investment and of the potential, the enlivening, exciting potential for something new, different, and better. All right. So as we know, as we talked about last time, minimally stressful statements, in contradistinction to optimally stressful statements, secure the attachment, strive to secure the attachment, and strive to lay the groundwork, create the backdrop, but do not specifically catalyze deep and enduring change. Optimally stressful statements, in particular in Model 1, conflict statements, however, are strategically designed to offer an artful combination of challenge, by highlighting either the price paid for old bad and or the enlivening possibility of new good in order to increase their anxiety, and support in order to decrease their anxiety by resonating empathically with their investment in old bad. And this will be necessary if deep and enduring psychodynamic change is the ultimate goal. So the net result of this intuitively titrated blend of challenge, which provokes the patient's anxiety, and support, which eases it, will be the generation of galvanizing optimal stress. Strategic leveraging of the patient's anxiety to incentivize transformation. All right, so leveraging the patient's anxiety. On the one hand, minimally stressful statements are strategically designed to, in Salman Akhtar's delightful words, to be with the patient where she is, described by him as homeostatic attunement, support that will decrease her anxiety. The net result of which will be to promote the therapeutic alliance, secure the attachment, set the stage. Those are minimally stressful statements. On the other hand, optimally stressful statements, which is what today is about, are strategically designed first to direct the patient's attention to where we would want her to go, disruptive attunement, Salman Akhtar. In other words, challenge that will increase her anxiety. And then to be with the patient where she is, support that will decrease her anxiety. If we just say the first part, she gets anxious, and patients made anxious will be tempted to defend and to shut down. And we don't want that. So we get it said for her by, in the second part, being with the patient where she is, i.e. support that will decrease her anxiety. Again, the net result of which will be to create internal tension and dissonance, and thereby incentivizing leverage. All right, so challenge, support. Do I challenge or support? Or perhaps, Model 1 conflict statements, do I do both? Indeed, we all find ourselves sometimes very confused about what to do next. Not quite sure what to do right now. do not follow, or keep left. That's a great photograph, not mine. That's a great photograph. All right. Okay, now working through the resistance. So we have optimally stressful Model 1 conflict statements. This is the prototype, the generic prototype. You know that. And those are three of the most important words that we will probably ever say to our patients as part of empowering them and highlighting what they really do know. You know that. We don't tell them what we know. We tell them what they know. You know that. And this is where I always say, you can't cheat. You can't say something, you know that, and then say something they don't know. That's cheating, and that's not fair. You know that, which will increase their anxiety because we're going to be highlighting either the price paid or the enlivening possibility of something different, new, different, and better. Okay, but made anxious, i.e. think defense, but made anxious, you find yourself, two of my other favorite words, you find yourself thinking, feeling, doing in order not to have to know. So there's the defense. You know that, increase their anxiety, but you resonate empathically with compassion and never judgment. You find yourself thinking, feeling, doing in order not to have to know. All right, now this, I added this slide and it's in updated PDFs. So you'll have it in your updated PDFs. You don't have it now, but you will. Two kinds of conflict. This is really important. Tony Chris, Anton Chris, son of Ernst Chris, and Chris and Hartman wrote together. Okay, there's convergent conflict and divergent conflict, and this really is important. Divergent conflict, these are either or situations, two mutually exclusive forces. And Max Farstein helped me to understand a little bit more about what I really meant here. So thank you, Max. All right, so these are either or situations, two mutually exclusive forces. Shall I wear my blue jacket or my red jacket for my presentation today? All right, now those are two, I mean, either or, you don't do both. It's not both and, it's either or. And as it happens, conflict statements are not about divergent conflict, because that would go like, you know that you could wear your blue jacket, but then you also find yourself thinking you could wear your red jacket. And sort of like, oh yeah, that doesn't get you anywhere. So convergent conflict, both end situations where one of the forces, an anxiety-provoking think id force, prompts mobilization of a second force. The second force wouldn't be there but for the fact of the first force. So one of the forces, an anxiety-provoking id force, prompts mobilization by the ego of an anxiety-relieving counterforce. You know that sometimes you feel angry with your wife, but you don't say made anxious, but you think it. You know that sometimes you feel angry with your wife, but you would rather not think about that right now. But perhaps, put in those qualifiers, but perhaps, but you find yourself thinking, nah, I'd really rather not think about that right now. So you name, so if you were to say, if you were to say, you feel angry with your wife, they say, oh, no, oh, no, I don't. So we could say, well, you know that sometimes you feel angry with your wife. And they sort of like, well, not so much. No. So you say, you know that sometimes you feel angry with your wife, but you would rather not think about that right now. Right, rather not think about it. But meanwhile, you're sort of getting a little something going here. So you name the anxiety-provoking force and then the defensive counterforce or the resistant counterforce, because we're working through the resistance. You know that your mother will probably never apologize. Now, again, do they know that? Yeah, they've had their mother for 40 years. And has the mother ever apologized? No. So you know, so you're not cheating, you know, but it makes them anxious to be reminded of this. You know that your mother will probably never apologize, but you find yourself continuing to hope that perhaps someday she will. So you can see how we're creating conflict there, both end situations. Okay, so the structural conflicts, or also known as neurotic conflicts or intrapsychic conflicts of classical psychoanalytic theory, are convergent conflicts. I'll say, okay, so Model 1 conflict statements are designed to address these convergent both end conflicts with an eye to generating internal tension between anxiety-provoking but ultimately growth promoting forces, pressing yes, and anxiety relieving, but growth impeding, resistant, defensive counterforces. You know that your mother will probably never apologize, but you find yourself continuing to hope that perhaps someday she will. You get both sides covered. Model 1 conflict statements are not designed to address divergent either or conflicts. You would not advance the cause much were you to say to your patient, you know that you could wear your blue dress tonight, but you find yourself thinking that perhaps you should wear your red dress instead. That doesn't really advance the ball much. All right, so working through the resistance, and those two books are the two books that I wrote back in 1994. Working with Resistance was called one of them, and a primer on working with resistance. And my first one, my very first book, so Working with Resistance, I wrote it for Jay Aronson, my dear friend Jay Aronson. So I got it done. I mean, just about killed me to get it all done. Got it all done. I'm like raring to go. And he says, well, Martha, he said, I want you to write a second book that I'm going to have you write before we publish the first one. Well, okay. And thus a primer on working with resistance came into existence, which is different, which highlights much more sort of process recordings and some kind of cool stuff. So those are my two books. All right. Or first two books. Okay. There's an important slide. Optimally stressful conflict statements are strategically designed first to increase anxiety by challenging the defense. In essence, you're saying to the patient, you have the healthy adaptive capacity to know. And then to decrease anxiety by supporting the defense, always with compassion and never judgment. So now we highlight, but you have the defensive need to resist that knowing. And you'll see from the many examples that I'm going to present that these are not about shaming the patient. These are about getting named on the patient's behalf what the patient otherwise was going to say. So all done with an eye first to making explicit the conflict within the patient between the healthy part of her that does indeed know and the less healthy part of her that resists that knowing. And then to generating growth incentivizing dissonance between those two parts of her self-experience. Okay, so here's some optimally stressful Model 1 conflict statements. First, you challenge, and you could reverse the order. And after a while, you just get it going and you challenge, support, support, challenge, support, challenge, whatever intuitively it feels right for you. First, challenge by directing the patient's attention to where you want her to go. Or actually, I kind of like it better, to where you would want her to go. And then support by resonating empathically with her defense, where she is, her investment in same old, same old. So here we go. You know that if you're ever to get on with your life, you'll have to let go of your conviction that your childhood scarred you forever. But it's hard not to feel like damaged goods when you grew up in a horribly abusive household with a mean and nasty mother who kept telling you that you were a loser. Now, all of these are either ones I've offered that got good results. I'm not providing some that got bad results, but got good results, or some of my students offered them and gifted them to me because they got good results. All right, let me read that one again because I kind of like that one. You know that if you're ever to get on with your life, you'll have to let go of your conviction that your childhood scarred you forever. Do they know that? Sort of like, yeah. Do they like knowing that? No. So what does it do to their anxiety? Increases it. But it's hard not to feel like damaged goods when you grew up, and now we're totally getting it. We've listened hard. They've used all these words in their time to describe their goddamn mother. But hard not to feel like damaged goods when you grew up in a horribly abusive household with a mean and nasty mother who kept telling you that you were a loser. You're coming to understand that your anger can put people off. But you tell yourself that you have a right to be as angry as you want because of how much you've had to suffer over the course of the years. You know that if your relationship with Alana is to survive, you'll need to take at least some responsibility for the part you're playing in the incredibly abusive fights that you and she have been having. But you tell yourself that it isn't really your fault because if she weren't so provocative, then you wouldn't have to be so vindictive. All right, so please note, as tempting as it might be for the therapist to highlight in the first portion of her conflict statement, something that she would wish the patient already knew. If the patient really does not yet know it, then it is better that the therapist resist her temptation to lead the witness in that way. So, for example, not good would be, you know that your unresolved feelings about your dad are making it difficult for you to find an appropriate life partner. Well, that might be okay, but saying this to someone who does not actually know this runs the risk of making the patient even more defensive. It's just not fair. It's cheating. It's not fair. You know that your unresolved feelings about your dad are making it difficult for you to find an appropriate life partner. No, they really didn't know that. You haven't done enough work to sort of get that, to get away with getting that named. All right, now, importantly, by locating within the patient the conflict between what she adaptively knows, right? Adaptive capacity to know, the healthy part of her. The conflict between what she adaptively knows and what she made anxious defensively, right? We mobilize defenses when made anxious. What she made anxious defensively finds herself thinking, feeling, or doing in order not to have to confront that anxiety-provoking reality. So by locating the conflict within the patient, the therapist is deftly sidestepping the potential for conflict between herself and the patient as a result of the therapist just saying stuff. Now, in Model 3, the intersubjective perspective of contemporary relational theory, yeah, projective identification stuff, projection, induction phase, containment, relenting on the therapist's part, resolution phase, whatever. That's a whole nother ballgame. So there will be, in that sense, conflict. That's Model 3, though, where you're negotiating at Darlene Ehrenberg's intimate edge of authentic relatedness. I'm not talking about that. Now we're talking about if you make an interpretation to a patient, and so often it will happen, people, clinicians, my colleagues, and certainly I in my time, you just say something and the patient says, no, I really don't think so. And you haven't really advanced the ball much. And so cases are presented at different conferences where the patient and the therapist are getting into struggles all the time about the therapist wanting the patient to understand something. And then what we therapists have learned to do is, if on the first try our interpretation doesn't work, then we try it again by changing one or two words, and then again, and call us relentlessly hopeful that we are wanting the patient to relent and wanting the patient to get it, that what we're saying is right. That happens a lot. I've done that too, I do have to admit. Okay, but by locating within the patient the conflict, the therapist is deftly sidestepping the potential for conflict between herself and the patient. More specifically, when the therapist introduces a conflict statement with, you know that, she is forcing the patient to take responsibility for what the patient, albeit begrudgingly, really does know. If instead the therapist, in a misguided attempt to urge the patient forward, resorts simply to telling the patient what the therapist knows, and Freud called that therapeutic zeal, not only will the therapist be running the risk of forcing the patient to become ever more entrenched in her defensive stance of protest, but the therapist will also be depriving the patient of any incentive to take responsibility for her own desire to get better. If it's always the therapist's voice, the therapist telling the patient what the therapist knows and what the therapist thinks the patient should do, we will be thereby depriving the patient of any incentive to take responsibility, to take ownership of her own desire to get better. All right, in other words, as a result of the judicious and ongoing use of conflict statements that force the patient, yes, force the patient to become aware of and to take responsibility for her state of internal dividedness about, for example, getting better, in other words, her ambivalence, the therapist will be able masterfully to avoid getting deadlocked in a power struggle with the patient, a power struggle that can easily enough ensue if the therapist takes it upon herself to represent the adaptive, healthy voice of reality by overzealously advocating for the patient to do the right, healthy thing. And we do all get caught up in that. I get caught up in that sometimes. Just like, oh my God, but I at least do say, but you could, blah, 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 blah. And I don't always then get that second part said, but you find yourself thinking, nah, I'm not sure I want to do that because, you could ask your parents for the money to support your treatment. They have, after all, volunteered on a number of occasions to support your therapy. But you find yourself thinking, no, 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 no can do, don't want to do. I don't want any more strings. I'm trying to cut the strings between me and my parents. So you're highlighting, you're getting named what you know would be the reason they're not going to do that thing that you'd said at the beginning. But at least you got both, at least you got that thing said, and then you resonate empathically. You are with them where they are. So in the first part, disruptive attunement, we direct their attention to where they're not. And in the second part, we resonate with where they are. All right, a stance that then, when there's a power struggle, leaves the patient made anxious, no choice but to become the defensive voice of opposition. All right, now please also note the implicit message delivered by the therapist in the second part of a conflict statement, when she uses such temporal expressions as for now, right now, at the moment, in the moment, at this point in time, which she will do when she is addressing the patient's investment in the dysfunctional, rigid, outdated defense. The therapist is attempting to highlight the fact that even if, for now, the patient would seem to be entrenched in protesting her need to maintain things as they are, same old, at another point in time, that could change. Okay, here we have some more. Again, first, challenge the defense to provoke anxiety. It's okay. And again, so many, my supervisees or my colleagues will sometimes say, oh, but I can't do that. It might upset the patient. It might make them anxious. They're like, yeah, it might. All right, but then support them so that by the time you're done, you've destabilized a little bit, but then restabilized with your support. And the support in conjunction with the synergy of their internal underlying resilience will be such that hopefully they will restabilize or reconstitute or reconsolidate at a higher level of adaptability and understanding. Okay, so challenge the defense to provoke anxiety and then support the defense to ease it. You know that ultimately you will need to confront and grieve the reality. So even though this is about grieving, we're picking up on their conflictedness about doing the grieving. So it's not model 2 where you're facilitating the grieving. Now, 2 minutes earlier, you might indeed use this conflict statement about their reluctance to do the grieving, but at some point, maybe 2 minutes later, you're going to be easing into some disillusionment statements, model 2, to facilitate their grieving. You know that ultimately you will need to confront and grieve the reality that Tom, like your dad, is not available in the ways that you would have wanted him to be. And that until you make your peace with that painful reality, you will continue to be miserable. But in the moment, all you can think about is what you can do to make him love you more. You know that someday you will have to let somebody in if you're ever to have a meaningful relationship. But at the moment, the thought of making yourself that vulnerable is simply out of the question. There's absolutely no way you are willing to run the risk of being hurt ever again. Particularly useful for working through the patient's conflictedness about remaining entrenched in old bad are 2 specific types of conflict statements. You don't really have to remember them, but it's sort of highlighting the point that I referenced them here. One is the "you know it could be better" conflict statement, which highlights the anxiety-provoking but enlivening possibility of new good. You know it could be better. And price-paid conflict statements, which highlight the anxiety-provoking cost of old bad. Both types of conflict statements are strategically designed to generate growth incentivizing dissonance, to make the patient anxious and then to ease their anxiety. You know it could be better conflict statements to create internal dissonance between the enlivening possibility of new good and the sobering reality of old bad. So we're creating tension, internal dissonance between the two by naming both. More specifically, in order to generate tension within the patient between her ever-evolving awareness, because we're interpreting and we're trying to increase her awareness, her ever-evolving awareness of the discrepancy between the possibility of something new, different, and better, and the reality of same old, same old. Whenever possible, the therapist will therefore offer, you know it could be better conflict statements that highlight both possibility and reality. The generic template form is, you know that, but you remain even so. You know that possibility, but you remain reality even so. You know that something new, different, and better, but you remain same old, even so, in the hope of galvanizing the patient to take action, to actualize the envisioned possibility. Okay, here are some. You know that it would be so much more rewarding for you to get a job that capitalized upon your strengths and upon what you most enjoy doing, namely connecting with people. But you find yourself hesitating because it is simply too overwhelming to think about losing the financial security that you have in your current position and have worked so hard to achieve. So first, we are challenging the defense by directing the patient's attention to the possibility of new good. That's the form of disruptive attunement that we're doing. And then support the defense by resonating empathically with the reality of old bad, that we get it, that she hesitates, or he, whoever this one is, hesitates because it's simply too overwhelming to think about losing the financial security that he's worked so hard to create and worked so hard to achieve. Okay, you know that you will not actually be happy until you get out of the toxic relationship with Jorge and let yourself find someone who will really appreciate and love you. Do they know that? Yes. I mean, we've been talking about this for a very long time. You know that you will not actually be happy. So we're helping them to envision that, it really could be better until you get out of the toxic relationship with Jorge and let yourself find someone who will really appreciate and love you. But the thought of ending it with Jorge when you've spent so many years trying to make it work is absolutely devastating. And your fear is that you simply wouldn't survive. So by the time you're done, you've advanced the ball a little bit, but also enabled the patient to know that you do truly, deeply understand, because you do understand. That's why they don't just get out of the relationship. You do understand. All right, price paid conflict statements, another kind, to create internal dissonance, to create internal dissonance between the pain and cost of old bad and the secondary gain benefit of old bad. More specifically, in order to spotlight the ambivalence of the patient's attachment to her dysfunctional, rigid, outdated defense, and to generate tension or dissonance within the patient between her ever-evolving awareness, because again, these interpretations are aimed to facilitate development of awareness, ever-evolving awareness. So, and to generate tension within the patient between her ever-evolving awareness of both the cost and the benefit of clinging to the defense. So you really need to understand the cost and the benefit. If they come late each time, ultimately work to understand, yes, the cost, but also the benefit, how it serves them, the price paid, but also their investment in, how it works for them, how it serves them, for us truly to understand their ambivalence, their mixed feelings about something. So whenever possible, the therapist will therefore offer price-paid conflict statements that highlight both the pain, cost, and the gain, benefit. You know that pain, but you remain gain even so. You know that price paid, but you remain invested in even so, in the hope of making the ambivalently held defense less ego-syntonic and more ego-dystonic. Now, these words are described in different ways, but what the way I like to describe it is ego-syntonic means something that's a little bit, quite frankly, kind of problematic, but it works for you. And ego-dystonic means, yeah, this thing is a little problematic and the patient is beginning to sort of like, this isn't really working for me. So our goal is to make the ambivalently held defense less acceptable, less ego-syntonic for them, and more ego-dystonic, because the ego-dystonia will be what provides the leverage. And of therefore galvanizing the patient to take action in order to resolve the internal dissonance and restore the homeostatic balance. Here we go. So again, first challenge by directing the patient's attention to the pain, cost, price paid for old bad, and then empathically support the defense by resonating with the secondary gain, benefit, payoff of old bad. You know that you're paying a steep price for your refusal to stop smoking, of particular concern because of your recurrent lung infections. Again, I'm not telling them what I know. I'm telling them what they know, and quite frankly, what everybody knows. You know that you're paying a steep price for your refusal to stop smoking, of particular concern because of your recurrent lung infections. But at this point, you're not quite yet prepared to take that step because you feel you have so little else in your life that gives you any real pleasure. You get it, you understand. Non-judgmental, with compassion. You know that you will need someday to get serious about losing the extra weight because it really is beginning to impact your health. But right now, the temporal element right now, you can't imagine being able to put yourself on a restrictive diet because you are already feeling so deprived in all the other areas of your life. I said something like that just yesterday with one of my patients. Okay, so whether creating tension within the patient by repeatedly highlighting the disconnect between the enlivening possibility of new good and the sobering reality of old bad, or the pain cost of old bad and the gain benefit of old bad, the therapist will be gradually shifting the balance by way of these optimally stressful conflict statements from the gain of old bad, secondary gain, payoff, to the pain of old bad, the price paid. So from ego syntonic to ego dystonic, which is where we want it to be. Okay, so in essence, okay, yeah, I added this slide. You know it could be better, and you know you pay a price for same old, same old. So you know it could be better, the enlivening possibility of something new, different, and better. And you know you pay a price for same old, but you remain invested even so. In essence, that's what you're saying here. That's what the message you're conveying. In essence, optimally stressful Model 1 conflict statements are strategically formulated to generate cognitive and affective dissonance between the adaptive capacity for awareness, you know it could be better, and you know you pay a price, and the defensive need to resist that awareness and to remain entrenched even so, but you remain invested even so. Holding on, letting go. All right, so a mnemonic. This is one of my favorite slides to help you remember, and there's a little smiley face. So there's some little things that rhyme here that I hope you'll appreciate. Where old bad defenses were, there shall new good adaptations be. As long as the gain is greater than the pain, in other words, the defense more ego-syntonic than ego-dystonic, the patient will maintain the defense and remain entrenched. But as a result of the patient's ever-evolving awareness of both the cost and the benefit, as a result of our optimally stressful conflict statements, once the pain becomes greater than the gain, i.e. the defense more ego-dystonic than ego-syntonic, then the stress and strain, I hope you like that one, all right, of the cognitive and affective dissonance thereby created between the pain and the gain will be such that it will provide the impetus needed for the patient gradually to relinquish her attachment to the dysfunctional defense, gradually over time, in order to resolve the structural conflict and restore the homeostatic balance. And again, it's a series of disruptions and repairs. The judicious and ongoing use of these optimally stressful conflict statements, challenge that will precipitate disruption, and then support that will prompt repair and restoration, and at a higher level of integration, balance, and adaptability. And these cycles of disruption, repair, disruption, repair, disruption, repair, importantly, providing challenge and support, and by tapping into the underlying resilience of the body, the wisdom of the body, the body's inherent ability to adapt to optimal stress. Okay, so now as a result of this working through of the defense, the resistance, which in essence is what we're doing here, the now stronger, as a result of all these cycles, the now stronger and more insightful ego will be better able to regulate the id's now tamer and more manageable energies. Again, Freud's well-known tame the id and strengthen the ego, such that no longer thwarted by an overwhelmed ego made anxious, the id's power, and you're going to see this is directly lifted from Freud, the id's power can be harnessed by the now more empowered ego and channeled by the ego into constructive endeavors and worthwhile pursuits, think sublimation as an example, and the id's modulated energy now providing the propulsive fuel for forward movement. All right, so here we go. In other words, ongoing use of optimally stressful conflict statements will have tamed the id and strengthened the ego. And by the way, mitigating the severity of the superego, criticizer, criticizee, abuser, abusee, I think that goes into model 3, where that dynamic, that dysfunctional relational dynamic gets played out on the stage of the patient's life and in the transference and in the real relationship. So I'm only talking about tame the id and strengthen the ego and mitigate the severity of the superego, which Freud did also obviously talk about also. That goes into model 3. All right, but in other words, ongoing use of optimally stressful statements will have tamed the id and strengthened the ego such that id energy, once reined in by ego resistance, will now be freed up enough that it can be used to empower the realization of life goals. Freud's horse and rider is indeed an apt metaphor for the therapeutic action in model 1, although again, I describe it a little differently from the way Freud had. As a result of the working through process, Freud's rider, a now stronger and more empowered ego, will have become more skilled at harnessing the power of the horse, a now better regulatable id, such that horse and rider will be able to move forward harmoniously and in sync, no longer in conflict, but in collaboration. And it is very clear to me that in my 3 times a week, 8+ years of intensive psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapy with a clinical social worker, that we did a lot of the freeing up of my energy so that I would be less in conflict and the forces would be more in collaboration. And then I did have a training analysis for 4 years with a male analyst, and we did some more work. And even with all of that, I didn't get it all done, but I did do, over the course of those years, I did do a fair bit. All right. Indeed, as the horse id is tamed and the rider ego strengthened, the defensive need to rein the horse in will have become incrementally transformed into the adaptive capacity to give the horse free rein. And thank you, Donna, for your input here. As structural conflict is resolved and eases into structural collaboration, from conflict to collaboration. Okay, all right, now moving on here. Now model 2. So I want to do model 2 and then we'll take a breath break. A hearing break and a breath break. Okay, model 2, the corrective provision perspective of self-psychology and other deficit theories. So structural deficit, the impaired capacity to be a good parent unto oneself. So that's the definition of structural deficit. The impaired capacity, kind of lifting from self-psychology, to be a good parent, a good caregiver, but I'll say parent, but it just more generally caregiver, but I'm going to say parent. To be a good parent unto oneself. Now, this deficit, and by the end of this slide, I want you to understand a little more about relentless hope and what gives rise to it. So this structural deficit creates the need. The need is to find in the here and now the good parent who was not to be found in the there and then. A need that then fuels the relentlessness of the patient's pursuits. Okay, the therapeutic action in model 2. Okay, this is an important slide. A corrective provision model, yes. Deficiency compensation model, yes. So yes, the model 2 therapist provides, yes, the holding and the being met empathically that were not consistently and reliably provided by the parent. Think positive transference. It's all good. Yes. This reparation functions as a symbolic corrective for the early on relational absence of good, relational deprivation and neglect, the early on failures in environmental provision, a la Winnicott. But there is more. So yes, Model 2, affective, holding, symbolic corrective for the early on failures in environmental provision. Now, although some Model 2 theorists believe that it is the experience of gratification itself that will be compensatory and ultimately healing, and I do think that to some extent that is true, but I have found that with my people that just that, quite frankly, doesn't really always get it done. So some do, though, believe that you can do that and it's all good. It'll be compensatory and ultimately healing, and it's all good. Most believe, however, that it is the optimal stress created by the experience of frustration against a backdrop of gratification. Frustration, disillusionment, properly grieved, that is optimal disillusionment, and Howard Bacall's optimal responsiveness, that will provide both impetus, challenge, and opportunity, support, for the filling in of structural deficit, serial accretion of new good, and consolidation of the self. Okay, so after all, if there is no thwarting of desire, then there will be nothing that needs to be mastered. There'll be no impetus and opportunity for adaptive transmuting internalizations, because it feels real good being in the session, and then you go out into your life on the outside and you're not being exposed to what had felt so good, and quite frankly, the structural deficit's still there. Okay, so if there's no thwarting of desire, then there will be nothing that needs to be mastered, and therefore no impetus for internalizing, adaptive internalizations, whatever good supplies, environmental provisions there had been prior to being disillusioned, disappointed, thwarted, frustrated. These transmuting internalizations are indeed adaptive, not defensive, but adaptive, health promoting. Transmuting, again, signifies structure building and facilitating the development of capacity, adaptive capacity, inasmuch as they make it possible for the patient to preserve internally a piece of the original experience of external goodness. That's why it's adaptive. You can now count on it internally, and you don't always need the object, the self-object, the empathic self-object to be there providing it. Okay, so the disillusionment statements facilitate the necessary grieving of disappointments. My eyes on the time, so I've got to pace myself here. You had so hoped that, or you had hoped that, which Robert had posted originally. You had hoped. You had so hoped that. I overused the word so I see that I just stuck it in there. I hadn't remembered that I had, but you had so hoped that, the three parts of a disillusionment statement, but you are beginning to realize that, and it devastates, enrages you. So the conjunctions are important, but you're beginning to realize that, and it devastates and enrages you. The therapeutic goal is to create galvanizing tension between defensive need for relentless hope and adaptive capacity to confront, grieve, and ultimately accept. So here we go. First, highlight what had been the patient's illusion. So their defensive need for relentless hope. Then, that's the first part. You had so hoped that I would give you the answers. You had so hoped that your mother would eventually apologize. You had so hoped that your mother would eventually apologize. Then highlight the reality of the patient's disillusionment. But you are coming to understand that probably she won't. Now you're speaking to not their defensive need, but rather not the defense, but the adaptation, their adaptive capacity to confront. But you are beginning to realize the reality that she might not, that might simply not happen. Finally, resonate empathically with the affect, pain, anger of the patient's grief, their adaptive capacity to feel the actual heartbreak. You had so hoped that I would tell you what to do, but you're beginning to realize that I don't simply give you the answers, and it infuriates you. You had so hoped that your daughter would reach out to you when you were sick, but you're beginning to realize that for now, you are not a top priority for her, and it is a devastating loss. Again, anger and sadness, all part of grieving. You would so have wished that I could know what you were thinking without your having to say it. But you're coming to see that it does not always work this way, and that breaks your heart. You had, in other words, the patient stage of absolute dependence, and would wish that you could know without her having to say. You had so hoped that your husband would ask you how he could help with the dinner preparations, but you're starting to get it, that offering to help with household things like that is not his thing, and it saddens and upsets you terribly. You had so hoped that we could have a personal relationship, but you are coming to realize, albeit reluctantly, that a therapy relationship is not really about friendship per se, and that breaks your heart. You had so hoped that your mother would apologize, but you're beginning to accept that she simply does not hold herself accountable, which is both enraging and devastating. Although you knew it would take time, I stuck in a little bit of something like conflict statement kind of, you knew, you did know, you knew it would take time. You had hoped that you would be feeling better after these several weeks of therapy. It really upsets you that you're still feeling such despair. You had been hoping that I would not make the same kinds of mistakes that everyone else in your life has, which is why it is so very upsetting that I too have now let you down. On some level, you knew that I didn't have all the answers. Even so, you'd been hoping that I might. And so it enrages you when I don't simply answer your questions directly. So you can play around with these a little bit. You had so hoped that I'd be able to make your pain go away, but you're beginning to see that therapy does not actually work that way. And it is absolutely devastating. My patient had said to me, listen, I live with pain. So I come to therapy, and I mean, I don't want to be talking about my parents. That just makes me feel pain. I mean, why would I want to do that? I want the pain to go away. And in essence, it could be that thing I talked about last time. I can't, you can, and you should, that dynamic. Damaged for life and therefore not responsible now. Therefore, looking to the outside to you to compensate for what I never got reliably and consistently early on. And quite frankly, I feel entitled to that. That's the I can't, you can, and you should dynamic. All right, well, here's some more. You can read these on your own. Let me just see. Let's see, in those moments, bottom one, when you let yourself remember just how limited your father is and just how defensive he becomes whenever you try to hold him accountable, it feels totally overwhelming and hurts so much. You had so hoped that you could get him to take at least some responsibility for his abusiveness. All right, now, let me see. Well, I guess I'll say this real quick. There are actually two kinds of disillusionment statements because this has come up recently for me with some of my supervising. One, I'm just going to name it and then we can let it go, but I just want you to kind of get the concept. I call it a grievance statement as opposed to a grieving statement. And grievance statements are a story about patients who are not actually grieving, but rather pseudo grieving maybe, and they're fetching a lot and making a lot of noise and angry and upset and tears, etc. But it's mostly they've got a lot of complaints and grievances because they're not actually grieving. Grievance statements for patients who are still clinging to their defensive need to avoid grieving. That is their refusal to grieve, the reality of the object's disillusionment of them. Instead of confronting and grieving that painful reality, they are filled with grievances against the object and relentless self-righteous outrage. You had so hoped that your mother would eventually apologize, but you're beginning to realize that probably she never will. And the injustice of her refusal to apologize fills you with outrage. Now, a grieving statement, however, would be for patients, maybe even the same patient down the road, who have advanced to the stage where they have the adaptive capacity to confront and grieve the reality of the object's disillusionment of them. You had so hoped that your mother would eventually apologize, but you're beginning to realize that probably she never will. But that's the same as the grievance statement. And that realization absolutely devastates you, angers you, and breaks your heart. I make a distinction in my own mind anyway, between outrage, which has the idea more of self-righteous indignation and entitlement, and anger. All right, so if all goes well, it will be within the context of safety provided by the relationship with her therapist that the patient will be able at last to feel the pain against which she has spent a lifetime defending herself. Model 2, facilitating their grieving. In the process, gradually transforming both her relentless need to possess, I'm going to finish up this part 2, we'll take a breath break, and then we'll be back for this model 2, then we'll be back for model 3. in the process, gradually transforming both her relentless need to possess and control, and when thwarted, her retaliatory need to punish and destroy. And this is where, on another occasion, I talk about the relationship between relentless hope, the masochistic defense of relentless hope, and relentless outrage, the sadistic defense of relentless outrage, and how the relentlessness of the patient's pursuit is related a little bit to sadomasochistic dynamics. All right, but anyway, within the context of safety, the grieving, in the process, gradually transforming both her relentless need to possess and control, and when thwarted, her vindictive retaliatory need to punish and destroy, into the adaptive capacity, that was the defensive need, into the adaptive capacity to relent, to grieve, to accept, to forgive, to internalize what good there was, to separate, to let go, and to move on, ultimately evolving to a place of appreciation and gratitude for all the good that was and is. As external goodness is internalized and structural deficit filled in, the relentlessness with which the patient had been pursuing the objects of her desire, that is her relentless hope, and refusal to accept their limitations, separateness, and immutability, will become gradually tamed. And she will evolve to a place of serene acceptance of the sobering reality that she will never be able to have all that she should have had as a child, and for which she has spent a lifetime searching. But that what she has is good enough. And of course, Winnicott talks about the good enough mother or the good enough parent. Acceptance is a simple recognition of the truth that this is the way things are, certainly in this moment anyway. So from relentless pursuit of the unattainable, there's the defense, to sober, mature acceptance of the reality, sometimes harsh reality, that it was what it was and is what it is. Now, grieving, just briefly, someone had asked last time about what is involved in grieving. Genuine grieving requires of us that, at least for periods of time, for all of us, patient for us, all of us, we be fully present with the anguish of our grief, the pain of our regret, and the intensity of the rage we experience when confronted with sobering realities about ourselves, our relationships, and our world. We must not absent ourselves from our grief. We must enter into it and embrace it. We cannot effectively grieve when we are dissociated, missing in action, or fleeing the scene. We need to be engaged. So that's why minimally stressful statements could well be used at such junctures. We need to be engaged in the moment, mindful of all that's going on inside of us, grounded, focused, and in the here and now. And I guess, and I didn't put it in here, but I should have put, we need to be embodied. Doggone it. Hello, Ed. I should have put in embodied. I didn't. If we are in denial, shut down, closed, numb, refusing to feel, or protesting the unfairness of it all, then no real grieving can be done. So there is this thing I call pseudo grieving that sort of seems like as if the patient's grieving, but quite frankly, no, it speaks to their refusal still to confront the reality of the object's limitations, separateness, and immutability, the fact that they can't be forced to change. Your grief can mend your broken heart. Grief is nature's way of healing a broken heart, said by Roberta Beckman and plenty of others as well. In sum, the therapeutic action in Model 2 is a protracted process that transforms the patient's defensive refusal to confront the reality of the object's limitations, separateness, and immutability, which fuels the relentlessness with which she pursues it, into the adaptive capacity to tolerate and accept those disappointing realities. In the context of the treatment, it requires that the patient work through her optimal disillusionment with you. That is, work through positive transference disrupted. Or she can do it with respect to relationships on the outside. Of course, that's fine too. But also it can get played out in the relationship with you, where probably you get the most mileage. So in the context of treatment, it requires that the patient work through her optimal disillusionment by confronting the pain of her grief and adaptively internalizing the good that had been prior to the perturbation, in Charles Krebs' words, the disruption, arriving ultimately at a place of serene acceptance, forgiveness, inner peace, and realistic realistic hope. If you can not always count on receiving it from the outside, better that you internalize whatever external provisions you can, so that they will always be there for you as internal resources. Harold Searles has suggested that realistic hope or mature hope arises in the context of surviving disappointment. Because people will always say, but wait a minute, isn't hope a good thing? Yes, it is. Realistic, mature hope is a wonderful thing. Relentless, less evolved, less healthy hope, not so much. The bad news will be the sadness the patient experiences as she begins to accept the sobering reality that disappointment is an inevitable and necessary aspect of relationship. The good news, however, will be the wisdom she acquires as she comes to appreciate ever more profoundly the subtleties and nuances in relationship, and begins to make her peace with the harsh reality of life's many challenges. Sadder she will be, yes, but also wiser. Sadder, but wiser. As a result of genuine grieving, grievances or unmourned disappointments will have become transformed into the healthy capacity to accept the sobering reality that we cannot make the people in our world change, but that we can and must take ownership of and responsibility for all that we can change within ourselves. And my Model 5 talks a lot about this, refractory inertia, overcoming that. By the same token, we must come to terms with the sobering reality that we cannot change our history, but that we can and must change how we position ourselves in relation to it, and how we position ourselves in our life going forward. You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending. C.S. Lewis. True, last slide here, and then we're going to take, I think, and we're going to take almost last. True happiness is not about getting what you want, but coming to want and appreciate what you have. All right, and finally, oh yes, many of you have seen this. I did one of my favorite slides. I'm here reminded of the New Yorker cartoon in which a gentleman seated in a restaurant by the name of the Disillusionment Cafe is awaiting the arrival of his order. The waiter returns to his table and announces, "Your order is not ready, and nor will it ever be." All right, well, why don't we take a brief break? On my clock here, the big hand is on almost on the 5, and when it's on the 6, we will return promptly and we will move forward with Model 3. Okay. Oh, good. And I get to read a couple of these things in the chat box. Thank you. I'll see about finding a link, Joel Henkin, who's feeling better. I think he's several weeks later, for Alan Shore's 2022 paper. Oh, yeah, that's good. Joel wonders, does grieving about objects' failings also include grieving a sense of either lost or damaged self? Yes, and or wasted years. Yes. Model 2, yes, it does. Grieving. That's an excellent point. I don't emphasize that, and only more recently have I come to appreciate that is part of the grieving. See, because I was so invested in thinking about grieving the object's failure, thereby prompting adaptive, transmuting internalizations of what had been out there, that I was not as focused on grieving your own disappointing of yourself, because what would you then internalize from yourself? But I think I've sort of made my peace with, yes, it does involve grieving and coming to a place of sober, mature acceptance that you are who you are. You did the best you could at the time, and certainly going forward, you will work so very hard to do the best that you can.
Martha, also in that regard, I think that's where a lot of IFS emphasis comes in, because the so-called what they call it, not the mature self,
Embracing of all the
Self-energy.
sub-personalities.
self-energy, that is, which is the main self, the main
The
benefit,
leadership, the self, capital
is
S.
present now to be a friend to and a helpmate to the
And to
parts
embrace all the different sub-personalities. Very
Yeah.
nice. Thank you, Joel. I hadn't realized that. So that's helpful. Thank you for that. And I hope you're feeling better. Hope you're feeling better. Thank you for letting us see.
3/4 of the way.
There you go. 3/4 of the way. All right, let's see. Ray, oh, Richard here. Regarding the short-term utility of analytic work, didn't Freud initially see patients? Yeah, for 6 months. Yeah, right. It's thank you, Richard Espinosa. Only over time have we sort of extended it sometimes to like 30 years and 35 years. Yeah. Yes, he did. He did talk about 6 months. Yes, Richard there.
But I appreciate the comment after that. He was also seeing them though multiple times a week. So I actually
Yes,
didn't
he
think
was.
about that with my comment.
That's right. That's right. Yes. But even so, people are even now. I was at the conference that I co-direct in the spring, the Harvard Medical School conference that I co-direct on psychodynamic psychotherapy with Dr. Larry Lifson. I was a discussant for a psychoanalytic case that was thought to be reasonably successful and had been going on for 35 years, a number of times each week. And, you know, that was part of what sort of provided, that was some years ago. And that was one of the things that prompted me to sort of think a little more seriously about things. All right, let's see. Joe, I think so. He saw them. Yeah, 6 days a week. Okay, good. Tucker here. Our understanding of what we do and what we are trying to do, as well as the society in which we do them, have evolved since Freud. Yeah, yeah, it's not the same world anymore, right? So how we deal with things is not still the same. All right, let me just see. All right, let me just see. And people, please go to the bathroom or do as you will. Let me see. Joel, a traditional neurotic is a rare bird nowadays. Yeah, right. Also, so many things that were startling insights in Freud's day, right? Like you might have sexual yearnings and longings for your mom or for your dad, are now baked into the culture and so lose some of their oomph in therapy. Yeah, it's interesting. Tucker wondering, I wonder if when insights are baked into the culture, if they may lose something important, the experience of thinking about ourselves and coming to understand ourselves in a new way, reorganizing ourselves. The experience of reorganization may be more important than the content. Interesting. Thank you, Tucker. That's a thoughtful thought there, and all those books back there. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I wonder. I like that. The experience of reorganization may be more important actually than the content. I like that. Another thing that I say is sometimes it's more important that we ask a question. And again, as you know, I don't tend to ask questions, although I've added another question that I want to mention too that I do ask. I don't tend to ask questions, but sometimes it would seem to be that it's the asking of the question that's important and not necessarily the answer, because it gets the person to thinking. The question that I have come up with, I didn't put in my slides for part 1, but I will say, I might say to a patient, and again, I don't usually ask questions unless I really feel I need to, but I might say to someone, as we're sort of maybe skirting around on the surface of things, I might say, do you think it's important? And this I call my cheating question. You're kind of cheating when you ask this. Do you think it's important that we try to understand how it is that you've come to be this way? Now, they sure better say yes. Or if they say no, which they might, no, I don't really think it's important. Then sort of like, well, I guess you know so much for your therapeutic alliance, and maybe we are talking about skimming along the surface a little bit. But so do you think it's important? So rather than launching into sort of the feeling always this way, sort of like the way you felt with your father, and you notice you're not getting much traction there, then you say, do you indeed think it's important that we try to tease out what might have given rise to this here in you? All right, now let me just see. Joel again, the incompleteness of providing gratification as a healing method is spoken to by a patient who once said to me, why can't my mother be more like you? Oh, that's good. Thank you, Joel. All right, I heard Anne Alonso, dear Anne, say, I bet this is Janet England, that the gratification of desire is the death of hope. Oh my God. And Alonzo was just amazing. I know Bob DeWars and others of us, and I think Janet and I, we learned at her feet. The gratification desire is the death of hope. Oh my God, that's very good. Not that all self-psychologists, and not that Anne was a mix of everything wonderful. Not that all self-psychologists would agree with that, but I like that. I certainly like that. And Alonzo also said when she'd come back from a vacation and the patient said to her, oh, we're going to get started here, the big hands on the six. The patient said to her, oh, wait, what did the patient say? Well, you know, saved by the clock. I need to move on here. Maybe I'll remember what she said. It was very clever. You already have so many people angry with you. You don't need to have one more. But that doesn't fit into what I just said. So I hope we just forget that. Okay, there was a wow there. All right, so let me try to share screen again. And let's see. Oh, good. Oh, good. I went back to where I was. Okay, model 3. Okay, here we go. Thank you all. Thank you all. Oh, good. And please feel free to put stuff in the chat box. I know there are a few I didn't get to. Maybe I'll be able to do a few of them at the very end. All right, model 3, the intersubjective perspective of contemporary relational theory. It features, and there are different ways to describe this, but pathogenic interjects or internal bad objects or charged toxic boluses of pathogenicity. But let's just go with pathogenic interjects. And Bill Meissner and Irene Fast and others highlight that rather than, as Freud talked about, just the criticizer interject that goes into the superego, talks about pairs of pathogenic interjects, victimizer, victim, abuser, abusee, seducer, seducee. And it's that dysfunctional relational dynamic between those pairs of pathogenic interjects that will get reenacted on the stage of a person's life and certainly in the treatment. So pathogenic interjects, filters that will contaminate the patient's experience of self, others, and the world, and give rise to relational conflict, Stephen Mitchell's term, when delivered into relationships. Model 3 is also about the here and now engagement between two authentic subjects. This really is a two-person approach, whereas model 1 is one person. Model 2, a la Andy Morrison, is a 1.5 person, whereby the half is you bringing the best of who you are into the relationship. Model 3 is a two-person approach, truly a two-person approach. Okay, so the here and now engagement between two relatively authentic subjects and the turbulence that will inevitably arise. So just because there's mutuality, it doesn't mean that it doesn't, Jessica Benjamin or Karen Marotta mentioned that just because there's mutuality, it doesn't mean that it's equal, the transparency of the one, the therapist, and the transparency of the patient. Okay, okay, the turbulence that will inevitably arise at their intimate edge, when the therapist either reacts defensively or responds adaptively to the force field created by the patient's projections. You can feel that we're talking now, yes, thank you, Max, about mutuality of impact, mutuality of influence. And where I highlight also that it's important that we therapists be semi-permeable, not totally permeable, and we get totally taken over, but nor impermeable, but rather semi-permeable. All right, so whereby the therapists think projective identification either reacts defensively or responds adaptively to the force field, two-person, created by the patient's projections. The contributions, model 3 is also about the contributions of both participants to the intersubjective in-between, the transitional space between. And co-creation, one of my favorite words, is very relevant here. It's a very relevant period, but anyway, especially relevant in model 3, mutuality of impact and influence, and use of the therapist's countertransference, use of the therapist's self and subjectivities to find and to be found by the patient. All right, so optimally stressful model 3 accountability statements are strategically designed to tease out. So notice this is a whole different focus. Model 1 is more about interpreting. Model 2 is more about grieving. And model 3 is about negotiating. Strategically designed to tease out transference, countertransference entanglements, projective identifications, crunch situations, Paul Russell's crunch situations, mutual enactments, co-created therapeutic impasses. The therapeutic action involves negotiating at the intimate edge of authentic relatedness, the overarching goal of which is to transform compulsive, and unwitting or unconscious reenactment into accountability. And in the words of Deborah Toll, relational mindfulness on the parts of both therapist and patient. We weren't talking about that in models 1 and 2. No. We're talking about it here in model 3, where the therapist uses her experience of self, uses her experience of being in the room with the patient to inform her understanding of what's going on in the intersubjective space. All right, his fault, her fault, their fault, not me. All right, projective identification. All right, because this is really important here. Because the model 3 therapist, and again, I say model 3 therapist, but it's the same therapist who a moment earlier was model 2 or model 1. It just, when I say model 3 therapist, I say therapist who has donned her model 3 hat in that moment, because we're ever busy, mutually enhancing, interdependent modes of therapeutic action. We're ever busy sort of shifting back and forth between these modes of therapeutic action. So when in the moment, the therapist is model 3. So because the model 3 therapist is participating in a relatively real relationship with the patient, and because the patient has the ever-present, remember they have charged toxic boluses as a result of presence of bad relational trauma and abuse, internally recorded in the form of these charged toxic boluses or pathogenic introjects. So because the patient has the which are filters, ever-present relational expectation of being failed, inevitably the therapist, unconsciously receptive to this relational need on the part of the patient, will find herself unwittingly drawn into participating as some variant of the patient's old bad object. Projective identification in action. Although this will often give rise to turbulence at the intimate edge between therapist and patient, it will also create both impetus and opportunity for the patient to rework her introjected badness. Now, I want to highlight something important here. In model 2, self-psychology, they talk about the inevitable failures of the therapist. And they posit the reason as being that nobody, whether it's the mother or the parent or the therapist, is perfect. So inevitably, there will be empathic failure. And that then needs to be grieved. But that's a story about the therapist and the therapist's lack of perfection. It's the way it's conceptualized. It's the way it's conceptualized in literature. But model 3 introduces the idea of a force field. This is now a two-person psychology model 3, the intersubjective perspective. And the idea of, and Thomas Ogden does such a good job of highlighting all this, Malin and Grotstein do as well, highlighting the force field created by the patient to draw the therapist into participating in the old bad ways. All right, we'll find then the therapist indeed, by being semi-permeable, will find herself unwittingly drawn into participating as some variant of the patient's old bad object. So model 2 was about positive transference disrupted, disillusionment, grieving it, serial accretion of new good. Model 3 is about negative transference and the working through of that by way of negotiating at the intimate edge, the projective identifications, and thereby serial dilution of the charged toxic boluses of pathogenicity, the pathogenic introjects. I said a lot there, but I'll keep saying it. So, all right. What was that? Let's see. Although this will often give rise to turbulence at the intimate edge, it will also create both impetus and opportunity for the patient to rework her introjected badness, because the patient's compulsive and unwitting reenactments, so a variation on Freud's repetition compulsion, but with an emphasis on what's actually being played out in the intersubjective arena. These compulsive and unwitting reenactments always have both unhealthy and healthy components, as does the repetition compulsion. The unhealthy component has to do with the patient's need to have more of same, no matter how dysfunctional, because that's all she's ever known. Having something different would create anxiety, because it would highlight the fact that things could be and could therefore have been different. But the healthy piece has to do with the patient's need to achieve belated mastery of the early on relational failures. Unhealthy part, healthy part. So model 2 versus model 3, I kind of said this. Unlike model 2, which pays scant attention to the patient's proactivity in relation to the therapist, it's a 1.5 person approach. Model 3 addresses itself specifically to the force field created by the patient who, under the sway of her reenactment compulsion, is unwittingly ever intent upon recreating, by way of projective identification, the early on traumatic failure situation. By drawing the therapist in to participating, these are Patrick Caseman's lovely words, by drawing the therapist in to participating in ways specifically determined by the patient's early on developmental history. I go on to say, and internally recorded and structuralized in the form of these pairs of pathogenic interjects. But in any event, all of this is being done by the patient, the healthy part, with an eye to encountering a new, different, better outcome each next time. And ultimately, as a result of encountering a better outcome, there will be serial dilution of the internal charge toxic negative. And I was taught way back that neurotics, they suffered internally, but they were the ones who suffered. Whereas character disorders were ever busy playing out their stuff on the stage of their lives. And that made them a character disorder. And in a way, in model 3, we are almost sort of inviting the patient to, and we're making use of character disordered, whereby they do play out their dysfunctional relational dynamics and their charged toxic boluses, do play them out. And that's why we have impetus and opportunity to give them the experience of something different this time. So we invite them to be character disordered. Okay, in fact, the patient might know of no other way to get some unresolved piece of her subjective experience understood than by unwittingly reenacting it in the relationship with her therapist. And only by way of recreating with her therapist, the only kind of relationship she has ever known, will the patient be able at last to negotiate a different ending. And so if we don't work in model 3 and allow for the patient to be experiencing us as some variant of the old bad object, then they're stuck with these charged toxic boluses inside of them. And they don't just go away. We can add new good to fill in for deficit, but the charged toxic presence of bad can't really be detoxified or modified because it's just inside. So we invite them, we allow it to be, we hope it'll be a safe enough place for them that they can dare to deliver what most needs to be delivered into the relationship. Okay, it's 2 phases, this is mine. 2 phases of a projective identification, but lifting a whole lot from Thomas Ogden and Arthur Mallon and James Grotstein, but this is my formulation from way back. The induction phase of a projective identification commences once the patient projects onto the therapist some aspect of the patient's experience that has been too toxic for the patient to process and integrate, and then exerts pressure on the therapist to accept that projection, thereby inducting the therapist into the patient's enactment. That's the induction phase. The resolution phase is ushered in once the therapist steps back from what has become her participation in what has become a mutual enactment and brings to bear her own more evolved capacity to process and integrate on behalf of a patient who truly does not know how, such that what is then reintrojected by the patient can be more easily assimilated into healthy psychic structure. And if all goes well, these iterative cycles will happen repeatedly, the net result of which will be serial dilution, gradual detoxification of the patient's internal pathogenicity. And that's why the optimal stressor in model 3 is relational detoxification. Model 1, cognitive dissonance. Model 2, affective or optimal disillusionment. And model 3, relational detoxification. Although inevitably, the therapist will fail the patient in many of the same ways that the parent had failed her. Ultimately, The therapist, this is Winnicott, must challenge the patient's projections by, excuse me, lending aspects of her otherness, Winnicott here, or externality to the interaction, such that the patient will have the experience of something that is other than me and can take that in. In essence, the therapist will contain the patient's projections by lending aspects of her own greater capacity to process and integrate, such that the patient will have the experience of taking in something that is now more processed, less toxic, and more manageable. In essence, what the patient reintrojects will be an amalgam, part contributed by the patient, the original unprocessed and toxic projection, and part contributed by the therapist. Everything's co-created, something more processed and less toxic. Okay, clinical vignette. A patient's grandmother, beloved grandmother, has just died. The patient, unable to feel his sadness because it hurts too much, recounts in a monotone the details of his grandmother's death. As the therapist listens, she becomes very sad. As the patient continues, the therapist finds herself uttering almost inaudibly an occasional, "Oh no," and "That's awful." As the hour progresses, the patient himself becomes increasingly sad. A projective identification just happened there, and it can happen in a heartbeat. And it doesn't mean that sort of like projective identification, working with that happens only after the patient's been in treatment for a very long time. No, 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 no. Here's an example of where it's a charged toxic bolus of an affect that makes the patient made anxious. Then in essence, well, here I explain it a little better here. Okay, in this example, the patient is initially unable to feel the depths of his grief about his grandmother's death. But by reporting the details in the monotonic manner in which he does, that's the exerting of interpersonal pressure. Reporting the details. So it's not like you push that way, but by reporting the details in the monotonic manner in which he does, the patient is able to get the therapist to feel what he himself cannot, and instead must defend against. In essence, the patient exerts interpersonal pressure upon the therapist to take on as the therapist's own what the patient does not yet have the capacity to tolerate. As the therapist sits with the patient and listens to his story, she finds herself becoming very sad. This, by the way, I'm not going to get into right now because of time. This is not about empathy. It's about being an authentic subject, not an empathic self-object. This, you allow the patient, the experience to come into you. She finds herself becoming very sad, which signals the therapist's quiet acceptance of the patient's disavowed grief. This is the induction phase of the projective identification. We could say that of the patient's sadness, that it has found its way into the therapist, who, able to tolerate what the patient finds intolerable, takes it on as her own. The therapist's sadness is therefore co-created, in part a story about the patient and his disavowed grief, and in part a story about the therapist, in whom a resonant chord has been struck. The therapist, with her greater capacity to experience affect without needing to defend against it, is able both to tolerate the sadness that the patient finds intolerable and to process and integrate it, which initiates the resolution phase of the projective identification. The therapist feels it, color her semi-permeable, but is not overwhelmed by it. It is the therapist's ability to tolerate the intolerable that makes the patient's previously unmanageable feelings more manageable for him. Indeed, the patient's grief becomes less terrifying by virtue of the fact that the therapist has been able to contain it by carrying that grief on the patient's behalf. This is just one example. A more similar version of the patient's sadness is then returned to the patient in the form of the therapist's heartfelt utterances, "Oh no," and "That's awful," such that the patient finds himself now able to bear the pain of his own grief, now able to carry that pain on his own behalf, now able to tolerate what had once been intolerable. Okay, here's another vignette, and I thank Barbara for this one. The patient, Janet, is a 31-year-old married woman who has a history of difficult relationships with almost everyone in her life. She's particularly troubled by her lack of close women friends. Janet has been working hard in the treatment, has made substantial gains in her professional life, and has very much improved the quality of her relationship with her husband. Janet and her therapist, a woman, have had a good, relatively unconflicted relationship. Janet clearly likes and is respectful of the therapist. Upon the therapist's return from a week-long vacation in Florida, Janet, at the end of the session, and just as she is leaving, turns back to her therapist and, as her parting shot, blurts out, "Great tan, bitch." The therapist, taken aback and at a loss for words, says nothing, smiles lamely, and nods goodbye. Although during the session, the therapist, made anxious, had reacted defensively by going blank, between sessions, the therapist is able to recover her therapeutic effectiveness by stepping back enough from her experience of having been slammed that, now less anxious, she's able to respond adaptively and therefore opens the next session with, "We've talked a lot about how upsetting it is for you to have so few," I know what's coming, "to have so few women friends. I think that now, in light of what happened at the end of our last session, I am coming to understand something that I had never before completely understood. When you left last time, your parting words were, 'Great tan bitch.' I wonder if by saying that, you were trying to show me what sometimes happens for you when you feel close to a woman and then find yourself becoming competitive." Here the therapist is courageously, I got some nods there, thank you, Joel, is courageously using her experience of self, her countertransferential reaction of being put off, to shine a light on a critically important piece of the patient's dysfunctional relational dynamics, and done in a way that's going to be really quite effective. All right, much is required of the Model 3 therapist for her to be able eventually to respond adaptively instead of reacting defensively to the patient's delivery of her dysfunctional relational dynamics into the therapeutic relationship. The therapist must first, I'm going to give lots of examples. My eye is on the time. We may run over a bit. I am so sorry. And it will be recorded and you'll have access to that by going to my website, marthastarkmd.com. It'll be there in a little bit. Okay, the therapist must first be able to tolerate being made into the patient's old bad object. And once she has allowed herself to be drawn into participating in what can sometimes become a very messy transference, countertransference entanglement, the therapist must then be able to extricate herself by stepping back, which will enable her thereby to recover her objectivity and thereby her therapeutic effectiveness. The way I put it is, I hope that at various points during your career, you say stuff to patients, you get angry, you get mad, you have a fight, and that you wouldn't ever tell anybody because you'd just be too embarrassed, except that probably if you can negotiate well at your intimate edge, it might well be that the relationship ends up much stronger for it, and there will indeed be some detoxification of internal charged toxic boluses. So every now and then, if you like lose your shit a little bit, that's not so bad. I certainly lost my shit in my time. I shouted at a patient once. I just shouted at her. I said, "Shut up." I said it like really loud, much louder than that. Actually kind of hurt my own eardrums when I said that. And another time I got so mad that I pounded my fist on the wooden arm of my chair, and then I kind of hurt my wrist a little bit. But you know, you can, yeah. All right. In essence, the therapist must have the capacity to relent. The therapist must have the capacity to relent. Furthermore, the therapist must have both the wisdom to recognize and the integrity to acknowledge certainly to herself and perhaps to the patient as well, her own participation in the drama that is being played out between them on the stage of the treatment. In other words, the therapist must have the capacity both to relent and to hold herself accountable for her countertransferential enactment. And I sure hope you have some, because that then will enable the patient to detoxify that charged toxic stuff inside, because by failing her, but by then stepping back from that and then acknowledging your failure, perhaps even also apologizing for it, and so on, what then goes back to her, what is reintrojected during the resolution phase, will now be a somewhat less toxic original projection, which was the original pathogenic introject. All right, in essence, projective identification involves symbolic repetition of the original relational trauma, but with a much healthier resolution this time, adaptive resolution. At the end of the day, the hallmark of a successful projective identification is the therapist's capacity to tolerate what the patient finds intolerable. Okay, so now for some examples. Optimally stressful model 3 containing statements. This is one of my favorites. And yes, this can often be used for borderlines. And I don't know, some of you might not like use of the word borderline. So I'll say borderline in quotes, and others of you, yes, you know exactly what we mean here. I define borderline as a bit old-fashioned, but borderlines have an impaired capacity to tolerate internal conflict and to sit with intense affect, especially angry disappointment, and instead have a tendency to act it out in all sorts of impulsive, hostile, and destructive ways, and so on. They also use splitting often. So here we go. So for those patients who need containment, but it could be anybody, it could be borderlines, but it could be anybody. First, resonate with their dysregulated affect, then highlight the containing reality that they do, albeit reluctantly, know. And all of these I've used with much success in my time with various patients. Perhaps you would wish that you could stay, but at the end of the session, but as you know, our time is up and we do need to stop. So first you resonate with the affect. They would wish that they could stay, but then you highlight what they do, albeit reluctantly, know. But as you know, our time is up and we do need to stop. When you get angry like this, you think about quitting. But we both know that someday you're going to have to stop running. At times like this, you think about never coming back because it hurts too much to be here. But we both know that if you're ever to get better, then someday you're going to have to give somebody a second chance. Finally, you just can't shake this conviction that if you feel hurt by me, then you get to do anything you want, including breaking the rules, which you and I both know we need to have in order for our relationship to continue. All right, now here's one. The optimally stressful rule of 3. I used to call it my triad, and then one day I changed it to the rule of 3, is designed to insist that the reenacting patient take responsibility for her provocative enactments. More specifically, the rule of 3 becomes relevant whenever a patient says or does something that the therapist experiences as provocative. You don't argue with the patient about whether or not it is provocative, but if indeed the patient has said or done something, or not done something that you experience as provocative, in other words, a provocative enactment, 2-person-y, model 3, then in order to compel the patient to take ownership of what she is playing out on the stage of the treatment, the therapist can ask the patient any of the following. 1, how are you hoping that I will respond? Which addresses the id. 2, any 1, 2, or 3 of these. How are you fearing that I might respond? Which addresses the superego. 3, how are you imagining that I will respond? Which addresses the executive functioning of the ego, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the LPSC of the brain. All three relational interventions demand of the patient that she make her interpersonal intentions more explicit. And I don't think I gave this example last time, but so I'll share it now. So I'm working with my patient. I've worked with her for a long time. And we get in person back then, before COVID. Anyway, and we get to the door of my office and she's about to leave. And then she says, oh, by the way, I think I'm going to take a break for a while from the treatment here. So I won't be coming back for a while. Oh my God, internally, like, oh my God, I was internally thinking provocative enactment. I almost forgot my rule of three, but at the last moment, I sort of summed it up and I said, how do you imagine I'm going to respond to that? I figure I might as well get some supervision from her. And she said, oh, you'll probably say, come back next time and we'll talk about it then. So I said, yeah, come back next time, we'll talk about it then. So she gave me my supervision. That's what indeed I was supposed to do. And she did come back the next time and so on. And we worked together many more years. Okay, so here's some. More generally, the therapist might choose to share as part of Model 3, these accountability statements, relational interventions, something about her own experience of being in the room with the patient. Or her own state of internal conflictedness as a result of something happening between them. So this is where she's using herself to find and to be found by the patient. Alternatively, and I'm going to give examples, the therapist might choose to highlight how the patient gets others to do unto her in the here and now some version of what had been done unto her in the there and then, which, if it gets played out in the treatment, it would be what I call a direct negative transference. So it's a negative transference, and she gets you to do unto her what had been done unto her in the past. So it's a negative transference and it's direct. She just replays with you the very same not good relationship she'd had with the parent. And witness, for example, Jessica Benjamin's concept of doer and done to. Or, but there's another alternative, and we know this happens all the time, how the patient, so the therapist might choose to highlight how the patient does unto others, because remember, there are always pairs of pathogenic interjects, doer and done to, and victimizer, victim, seducer, seducee, abandoner, abandee, none, or how the patient does unto others in the here and now some version of what had been done unto her in the there and then. Do you see what I'm saying? This is an inverted negative transference, and it feels pretty yucko to be at the receiving end of it, but it happens all the time. Witness, for example, the concept of Ferenczi's and Anna Freud's identification with the aggressor, where they're doing unto you what had been done unto them. But both will get played out and ultimately will get played out. And this is also why, remember, I'd said Model 3 is for mitigate the severity of the superego. This is where criticizer, criticizee, judger, judgee, whatever, get introduced into the intersubjective in between. All right, so, okay, here's some. The therapist might choose to share something about her experience of being in the room with the patient. I've said to a patient, it would seem that I'm in the doghouse these days because, no matter what I've said, it's just not going over very well. So I name it. So rather than pretending that I haven't noticed that the last 3 or 4 things I've said, the patient completely, pushed away, it would seem that I am in the doghouse these days. I'm zeroing in on the here and now engagement. I wonder if the frustration and helplessness I'm feeling now in relation to you is similar to the frustration and helplessness you have spoken of having felt in relation to your father, an inverted negative transference. Let me say it again. I wonder if the frustration and helplessness I am feeling now in relation to you is similar to the frustration and helplessness you have spoken of having felt in relation to your father. Or this beautiful one by Kit Bolus, like, oh my God. You tell me something about yourself. I am just in the process of digesting it and storing it for further understanding of you. And then along you come, wham, and tell me that what I've digested and stored inside me did not come from you at all. The problem I find is how to live with the despair I feel occasioned by your disappearances. Oh my God, is that like so cool or what? Oh my God, okay. All right, now here's some more. You can introduce accountability statements in the following ways. I don't mind at all throwing myself under the bus. Because usually, quite frankly, there are plenty of things that I have done not quite right. So what the heck? You throw yourself under the bus, and then the patient will be more likely to be willing to acknowledge sort of stuff that she's been doing. So I don't make up stuff, but I just acknowledge it. Like, for example, maybe the timing of my interpretation was really off. So that so maybe I'll still stick with the content was spot on. I won't say to the patient, well, I think the content was spot on, but I will say it occurs to me that my timing was really bad. And sometimes I'll say the panel of 10,000 objective judges would have judged me on that one, probably given me like a C- on that one, because I really, that my timing really bad, or I didn't get that right at all, did I? So I'll rate myself sometimes by this panel of 10,000 objective judges. Okay, it occurs to me that, and again, two-person stuff focusing in on the relational dynamic between us. It occurs to me that by way of your behavior in here with me, you are helping me to understand something that I had never before entirely understood. You see how you're lending dignity to what they might be acting out in the treatment or their reenactment. It occurs to me that by way of your behavior in here with me, you are helping me to understand something that I had never before entirely understood. Or I think that you have been trying to communicate something important to me that I had been refusing to see. Or I wonder if my difficulty appreciating just how desperate you were made you feel that you had to do something dramatic, suicide attempt, in order to get my attention. So you're recontextualizing it, reframing it as being a story about the intersubjective space between, and highlighting that it was your own difficulty appreciating just how desperate they were that had, in essence, forced them to do something dramatic in order to get my attention. All right. Okay, now, as Erwin Hoffman, oh, bless his soul, has suggested, if the therapist, this is so useful, is aware of feeling conflicted in relation to the patient, she may choose to share the fact of this conflictedness with the patient. I want to tell you X, but I'm afraid that Y. Here, the therapist is expressing aloud the conflict with which she is struggling, a conflict that might well be reflective of the patient's own internal state of dividedness. Yeah, projective identification. Okay, I am tempted to give you the advice for which you are looking, but my fear is that were I to do so, I would be robbing you of the impetus to find your own answers. Or, I find myself feeling angry with you for being so often late. See, we get to acknowledge, we get to acknowledge stuff here about how we might be feeling. Whereas in model 2 and model 1, in the words of, I'd referenced this earlier, Evelyn Schwaber's paper written in the 1990s, countertransference, the analyst's retreat from the patient's vantage point. So in that sense, it's not a good thing because it interferes with the analyst's ability to be fully present. In model 3, we use our countertransference. In this two-person approach, we use our countertransference to inform our understanding of the patient and to let the patient find us and so on, and to be found by us. And yeah, to be found by us. I find myself feeling angry with you for being so often late and wanting you to understand how it impacts me. But then it occurs to me that it might be more important for us to try to understand what you might be wanting to communicate to me by way of your frequent lateness. So it's dignifying the concept of what the patient might be compulsively and unwittingly reenacting on the stage of the treatment. Okay, I'm tempted to respond to your request by saying that of course you can borrow one of the magazines in my waiting room. But I'm also realizing that were I simply to say, okay, we might then lose an opportunity to understand something more about you and perhaps about us. And this one, I hope you'll find very useful. To a patient who says she wants the therapist's approval regarding her decision to terminate, a termination that the therapist thinks is premature. I am tempted simply to offer you the approval you are seeking. It is, after all, important that you do what feels right for you. But I'm also aware of feeling within myself that the time is too soon, and that were I to support your decision to leave, I might ultimately be doing you a disservice. I talk a lot about not wanting to do the patient a disservice if I sort of let something pass. I don't want to do them the disservice of missing something, if indeed there's some message in that for me, for us. I talk all the time about us, we co-created. I wonder if this feeling I have in relation, okay, here's some more. I wonder more generally. I wonder if this feeling I have in relation to you, and then we're almost done. I wonder if this feeling I have in relation to you that no matter what I say, it won't be good enough, is like the feeling you have spoken of having had in relation to your father, for whom nothing was ever good enough. And it's an inverted negative transference. I'm focusing in on my feeling that nothing I can say here would seem to be good enough, just like probably his experience in relation to his father. I'm not specifically saying, oh my God, you're being as critical and judgmental of me as your father was of you. I'm actually focusing in more on my experience by way of resonating then with his experience. I find myself feeling so angry at your mother. I wonder if some of those feelings are actually a story about feelings you have about your mother, feelings you would rather not have to acknowledge. Okay, it occurs to me that we have managed to recreate in here the very same dynamic that had characterized your relationship with your double-binding father. Namely, the feeling we both had that no matter what either of us might do, it wouldn't get the other's approval. But all of this, painful as it is, gives us an opportunity to experience firsthand how toxic the relationship with your father really was. Except that now we can do something about it. So Model 3 is ultimately a story, just our last 3 slides here. 4 slides. Model 3 is ultimately a story about the therapist's use of her authentic self, her countertransference, to provide containment and thereby to facilitate modification of the patient's sense of self as bad as a result of those charged toxic boluses. More specifically, modifying the patient's sense of self as bad will require toughing it out at the intimate edge of authentic relatedness, often. Both participants bringing heart and soul to the intersubjective in between, such that this time there can indeed be a different outcome. At the end of the day, the relational perspective of Model 3 is a story about transforming the patient's defensive need to reenact, compulsively and unwittingly, her unmastered early on relational dramas on the stage of her life, into the adaptive capacity to take responsibility for her dysfunctional ways of acting, reacting, and interacting. Accountability, the quality or state of being accountable, especially an obligation or willingness to accept responsibility or to account for one's actions. And finally, my very last slide, in closing, I would like to borrow from Stephen Mitchell a wonderful anecdote that captures the essence of the quintessential struggle in which all of us are engaged as we attempt to master our art. Or perhaps I should have said, master the art and science of interpretation. I should have said that. Mitchell writes, Stravinsky had written a new piece with a difficult violin passage. After it had been in rehearsal for several weeks, the solo violinist came to Stravinsky and said he was sorry. He had tried his best, but the passage was too difficult. No violinist could play it. Stravinsky said, I understand that. But what I am after is the sound of someone trying to play it. As therapists, our work is exquisitely difficult and finely tuned. And often we will not be able to get it just right. I'd said last time that, I could make 20 or 30 mistakes in a session. Perhaps, however, we can console ourselves with the thought that it is the effort we make to get it just right that will ultimately count. Now, that's the end of this. Thank you. And if you'd like to be on my mailing list, although I think I probably have most of your emails already, please. Oh, that's not even my right email address. I should have changed that slide. And then here are lots of references. And that's it.
Wonderful, Martha. Thank you so much. That was such a whirlwind tour. I mean, I know all this stuff already. I've done it all, and still it's great. Each time I listen and keep revisiting it, helps to digest it. And I'm sure that's the case for many others here. So thank you very much. I've just posted on the chat when our Q&A is, and I will send an email reminder out to everyone.
And I'm sorry, can I just get clarification? Did we decide the Q&A starts at 17.00 or 18.00? So 17.00, which is 12 noon for people on the East Coast, right? And 9 a.m. for you folks there out on the West Coast. But I do hope that you will think seriously, please. Gina has been asking me repeatedly to do that, my William James College course in October. And I am indeed, Gina, I am doing that. I am doing that. Yeah, I am going. And Anita, I hope Anita, you'll join us. Anyway, oh, good, I got away from her. So please, I hope that's where you get to present clinical vignettes, and it's this online, amazingly something I call it this wonderful combination of intimacy and anonymity, because it's all kind of yeah, it's whatever. So I really hope when I get some smiling, oh, hello, Kate, and so on. Well, listen, yes, and the recording available. Well, technically, I guess we're done. Oh, we have a little music, don't we?
There's lots of great questions in the chat, which hopefully we'll be able to get to in the Q&A. But I'm going to hand over to Robert now. Is that right, Martha?
Can I just say one thing? I would love to wrap up with the song. So please, the song, I would love that. But then I'm going to look at some of these questions, if that's okay. So please feel free to go. And this will all be, I think, recorded. Well, Robert will let us know if this will be recorded, this part here. But let's see.
Yes.
So I'll look at a few of them. Yeah.
It is.
It is. Oh, good. So I won't do everybody's, especially if it's a question that's too hard for me to answer. I didn't mean that. All right, let's see. I gotta go back here a little bit. Okay, so I'm just gonna skip around a little bit, please. Is the recording available for me to listen to? Absolutely. There's lots of valuable learning. Oh, that I need to go back to. Yes. So you go to my website and go to the different things along the top, and there's all sorts of information for you. All right, Renee, where does it, and thank you, Renee, for your ongoing support. Where does a sort of passive acceptance of awful conditions as necessary, natural, unavoidable fit as a defense? I wouldn't call that a defense necessarily. It depends upon the situation. Passive acceptance. Well, if it's passive, of awful conditions as necessary, right? Sober acceptance of harsh realities, that it is what it is and was what it was. And of course, it depends on whether it really has to be that. So how we position ourselves in relation to it might become relevant there. If we see it as just, it's something just terribly painful that we begrudgingly awful have to just accept, when in fact there may be a way to reposition ourselves in relation to it, so it won't be quite so bad. I'm thinking of so many social issues, yes, that impact a client, even making them angry, but where they, or as a society, buy into a false idea that nothing can be done. Yeah, so right on for doing what we can to make changes in terms of taking responsibility for how we live our lives going forward. Think climate change, I know, or pandemic, or the impact on individuals' mental health of Chomsky's idea of manufacturing consent. Oh, that's good. All right, future relational school events. Joel, the process over the content idea perhaps goes with the Good Witch in The Wizard of Oz. Was asked why she didn't tell Dorothy she could go back to Kansas anytime, because she wouldn't have believed me. She had to find out for herself. Thank you, Joel, that's good. Beverly had said mistakes in neighborhood of truth. Yes, I like that. What about the potential mutuality of patient therapist? We dealt with that. Yes, thank you, Jean Bellows, for reminding us of that. Okay, Brian, after his swim in the Atlantic, brings to mind the notion of turning passive to active. Oh, yeah, from Weiss and Sampson. Yeah, mastery, control mastery theory, whereby the patient does to us at an unconscious level what was once done to them. Yes, thank you, Brian, for reminding us of that, reminding me of that. Sampson and Weiss, absolutely. Control mastery theory. All right, Joel, there's always a risk if you're being real that you will fall into some mutual enactment. Yep, that's okay, or acting in. That's why we need our own therapy, our supervision, consultation, peer supervision, and at least you do, bless your soul, Joel, that's why you're so good. And self-reflection, so all of this. Or have a colleague that you can really just kind of do peer consultation with, and you just get to tell them all this, everything you want to tell them. Brian again, I wonder if repetition compulsion could be understood as failures to optimally respond. Oh, interesting, to projective identifications, as likely happens all the time and everywhere, but hopefully not too often in therapy, smiley face. Brian, that's very astute. Yes, if repetition compulsion could be understood as failures on the part of the therapist to optimally respond to projective identifications. Yeah, as likely happens all the time. Yeah, good. And giving it then, that got a thumbs up. A different outcome. All right, more. Amen. Richard gave me an amen, gave him an amen. Learned from book by Jerry Gans. What was it like to have a therapist that put her foot in her mouth? Huh, Janet England there. Okay. All right. Hi, Dr. Lynn again. Can I go back to recording? Yes, you can. Brian again. Sounds like the capacity to respond optimally, i.e. not reflexively, right, more reflectively, more mindfully to projective identifications relates to, yes, in serial dilution of toxicity, yes, it does. And by extension to a softening within the patient of the compulsion to repeat or reenact, yes, a softening and less rigid and less reflexively, mindlessly, compulsively, unwittingly repeating, reenacting the unmastered that are now becoming a little more mastered relational traumas from early on. Thank you. And that got a thumbs up as well from people. Thank you, Brian. Brian is pretty cool here. All right, let's see, Dan Gordon, in case 2 of accountability statement, it can sometimes feel like victim blaming. So you have to sort of, my style is such that, well, I mean, people will say that sometimes I interrupt them when I shouldn't, so I get faulted for that, and so on. I don't usually, I don't, my patients don't tend to, I mean, maybe they thought privately that I'm blaming them or they feel blamed and shame. That's not something my patients tend to feel, but so I think you just need to be very careful, but across between holding them accountable and forcing them to take some ownership, but not, not totally destroying them. On the other hand, let me also say that if indeed you do end up inadvertently shaming them or blaming them, then we negotiate that at our intimate edge and we deal with that. So we respond in either oh my God, or they share with you, or you sense it in their bodily something, your relational interoception, you sense that they, are taken aback or feel bad. You're ever busy tuning into their level of anxiety, and then you negotiate at your intimate edge. So if we make them anxious, or we frustrate them, or we blame them a little bit, or we shame them, perhaps inadvertently on some of those, then we try to acknowledge it and hold ourselves accountable. Joel, it really leans on the strength of the positive real relationship. I think timing and tone and where you're coming from is so crucial. Yes, you got to want thumbs up on that. Kate, thank you, Martha. 2 questions, Ray. Disruption. Does disruption happen when the therapist is off in her assessment, not just then, of the patient's level of anxiety, and or, so it would be yes, and or ability to tolerate the extent of her challenge? Yes, it could be both. Disruption happens when the therapist is off in her assessment of the patient's level of anxiety. Yes, and or her ability to tolerate, the patient's ability to tolerate the extent of the challenge. Yes, and again, if indeed we inadvertently disrupt or advertently disrupt, then we get to model 3, negotiate at the intimate edge. We do. And how is his disruption different from empathic failure? Right. It could be part and parcel of it. Now, let me say, if there's a sense that the patient, by doing stuff, force field, model 3, has drawn us into failing them, or relational failure, that's one thing, and we work in model 3, negative transference. Or it might be that it's a model 2 where they had imagined us to be able to be available in a certain way, and then we fail them inadvertently or vertently, whatever the opposite of inadvertent is, advertently. Anyway, I think I got that. You got a heart for that one, Kate. All right. Also, Martha, do you think it would be worthwhile if, when developing your formulation for a patient, to look at each model and assess whether, how, or the extent to which the patient seems to be struggling in that area? I think intuitively, I sort of do that. If indeed they're struggling more with conflictedness, neurotic conflictedness, model 1. More sort of relentless pursuits, model 2. In model 3, compulsive reenactments, model 3. Model 4, relational retreat, model 4. And model 5, refractory inertia or rootedness to the spot, model 5. So yes, I think I do unconsciously a sort of checklist. And in that moment, then I don either model 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hat. And then if I get it wrong, I go to another hat because they're like, oops, that one didn't work. I'll try another hat. So I might have thought it's a model 2 disappointment and so on, realized, now I think it's more model 3, a force field in the two of us. All right, Janet Thomas, thank you. Thank you, Martha. Oh, your generosity is inspiring. This will be your legacy. Oh, Janet. Janet Thomas. Oh, thank you. So thank you, Janet. J-Y-O-T-I, J-O-T. Thank you. Martha and Adele and Robert. Oh, good. Greg Friedman. Powerful set of ideas. Thank you, Martha. Yes, insightful, practical. Oh, good. These are lovely. Thank you. Okay, Sandra, yes. Although you know my stuff from before. I walked in and thought I heard that there will be a Q&A for this class as well. Could you let me know if this is true in date and time? Yes, it will be listed, but it's 2 weeks from now and 1 day on Sunday at Eastern time at 12 noon for 1 hour. Sunday. Oh, look, Adele answered it. There you go. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right, Joel. Darn it, Martha. I promised myself not to cry. Oh my gosh, at the end of your presentation. Thank you. Thank you, dear Joel. That was very sweet. Jody, beautiful message from Stravinsky. Yeah, and you. Thank you. Yeah, isn't that cool? Stephen Mitchell. Credit. Oh, thank you so much, Martha. Brilliant. Thank you, Kate.